The Seattle Times AIA Home of the Month program first appeared in 1954. The article on Sunday, January 3rd, described an architect-designed house open to the public from noon to 6. As the decades have rolled by, the feature has attracted an ever-growing response. Since 1990, it has become the norm to expect 2,000 visitors to walk through each featured residence. Times journalist and editor Marjorie R. Phillips initiated the program with a group of Seattle architects, members of the American Institute of Architects. And she wrote the monthly feature articles for the program's first 2 decades. In a recent interview, she described the goal as raising consciousness. In the words of the program announcement,
everyone interested in watching the important trends toward better living and better design in our great Northwest will enjoy the inspection of each Home of the Month.
Some of the area's most well-known architects established their reputations through the Home of the Month program. Since its first year, the program has included an annual prize for the Home of the Year and acknowledging the owner, the architect, and the contractor. In later years, the Home of the Year event has expanded and gone public, since 1984, bringing a growing audience to hear some of the nation's most distinguished architects.
Over 40 years, the Seattle Times AIA Home of the Month program has both illustrated and influenced the development of the unique Pacific Northwest architectural culture. Its popular approach means that it shows the way people have really lived over that period, not as it might appear in a glossy architectural magazine, perhaps. When we began to anticipate the 40th anniversary of this program in 1994, we undertook an intense research effort to document the 450 homes featured in this program. And in late 1993, we assembled a distinguished panel of journalists and architects to help tell this story.
In 1954, Dwight Eisenhower was in the White House, settling into his role as leader of the free world. Meanwhile, in architecture,
that's really basic.
The new medium of TV was shaping values and creating role models. And in architecture,
this is another box. This is the box time.
In music, Elvis introduced America to a new phenomena, rock and roll. And in
this is the box time.
The slogan was better living through design, and design meant modern.
It's box period.
By 1962, sleepy Seattle was looking up and ahead to a bright future as it hosted the 21st Century Exposition for the world to see.
I think there are some significant developments in architecture that probably went on to influence much of our work as it still does today. It was obviously a decade of change and kind of new thought process and taking kind of post-war housing and simple plans and kind of exploding them and taking advantage of the environment and all kinds of things. We found in this home a real representative evolution of the floor plan and the beginnings of starting to kind of explode that plan open, a sense of formality and geometry, exposure of structure, entry courtyards, keeping the entry away from a carport or a garage.
Paul influenced a lot of my approaches and just saw a lot of that kind of very simple, affordable housing developing at that time period.
Now we're starting to see the roof plates being tilted up, and you kind of can feel what's going on in this house relative to a lot of things that we do today with contemporary spaces, bringing in clear stories and lighting, some punctuations in the roof. We're starting to see in this plan a real combination of open spaces with a family room and a kitchen and really more of a Northwest contemporary lifestyle. We're skipping now to December of 1957.
$16,800, this house. Only 1,300 square feet, 3 bedrooms. The bedrooms are really small, just a very, very simple shed roof on a site overlooking a ravine out in 88th and 40th Northeast. And Carson Leon still lives in it, still loves it.
The one house that really blew me away was Arnie's, where it seemed to be, in this decade, one of the first times where the architect very boldly went outside the exterior walls and started to truly integrate architecturally the site of the house.
Beyond that, we saw a real sense of honesty like the last house in the way that the structure is being expressed. Very, very representative of what was taking place, both in plan and in elevation. We see here the kind of the tilted roof plane again, and you just knew that inside you saw the structure and the post and beams that were very expressive, very organized. A very simple plan, very expressive. It happens to be out of steel, but there were homes of the era that took off from the same theme in wood and post and beam. Just very simple, compartmented, organized, center atrium, lots of natural light, which, you know, architects then and now in the Northwest embrace. And I think that we found a real simplicity and strong form in the way that these two elements interacted between the structure and the light and the air. Again, reflecting a very simple, straightforward plan, but now raising that roof plane in elevation to get in some clear story lighting. You just knew that there was a lot of exposed structure inside.
In the stunned aftermath of assassination, a new leader set out to build the Great Society. Even this bright hope for the country's future was soon tarnished, bogged down in an Asian war, and a nation was torn apart along generational lines. The British invasion brought pop music to new highs, which soon turned psychedelic in the summer of love. The music became the anthem of change, running headstrong, head first, headlong into a police barricade in Chicago. The turmoil of the era even shook the foundations of design, as complexity and contradiction supplanted the simplicity of an earlier time.
We selected several trends and representatives of those trends. He has been sort of for years, operating to his own drummer and an architect that's been true to himself and his style, which is Frank Lloyd Wright. We felt that he and Wendell Lovett sort of fell into a category of their own, where they became sort of the embodiment of their own style, but still doing work in a way that was sympathetic with the Northwest and the conditions of the site and climate. And this is the other maverick that we talked about, Wendell.
He declared, I think, his independence and has never really compromised his approach. And I think that he has a very highly individualistic style.
This is the first example we found in the book of his work, and he might be doing something similar to this today for a little cabin or something up in the San Juans.
I think we found this style the predominant style of our period. We kind of classify it as Northwest suburban, and most of these houses, I think, were built in the suburbs because they seem to require a fair amount of property.
Here we become sort of the sheltering roof and the balconies and the building into the hillsides, as it appeared to us as the cheap flat lots that Kirk was able to buy for $2,000 became $10,000, so a lot of the $2,000 lots got on the hillside. This is an example of what we call the California style, or the arts case study style. A very simple plan, geometric, and very straightforward structure.
Very controlled plan, very disciplined, and actually these houses were normally built on, most of them were built in flat lots, very open, and again, very influenced by the California style.
This is an example of maybe the first great change, where angles and geometry and complexity starts to become part of the architectural palette.
It's, I think, sculpture for the first time is playing a very important part in this, and the attempt for the house to become maybe more of a work of art than a structure, at least both. But architecture, of course, is supposed to be art.
And I can sort of reiterate three comments that I got from architects on this particular house. One was, it was a flat site solution on a sloping site. And Al Bumgardner, after touring it, said, it's an interesting collection of small rooms. And finally, Bill Turnbull went through it and he said, warmed over MLTW. So that's primarily it.
The 70s saw the end of the Vietnam War, the scandal of Watergate, and the beginnings of the energy crisis. The passions of the 60s dissipated as the nation came to terms with its limitations. The disco beat pounded mercilessly into our consciousness. Its goal may have been to drown out all our thought, all awareness, all hope of even carrying on a civil conversation until we had no choice but to...
Just come out of the Boeing bust after a period of very rapid growth. People were hard up. There was a lot of concern about economy. Some of the designs reflect that. We were using sites that hadn't been considered before because we were trying to get back to the city. But we also had people who, there was this underlying anger that we had let ourselves be dominated by one industry and had gotten us into this trouble. Diversity was coming out. People were reaching out for new ways to express themselves and do things. And I think the 70s really show that. And at the times, we were very eager at the time to see what you would come up with next for your Home of the Month entry, because it was really fun to see this expression.
We have chosen the house from Hobbs Fukui that was from November of 1974, and had selected it for its very stylized, geometric, both floor plan and elevations. We termed it as being built like a model. If you could see the sides of the walls of the building built like are built cardboard, and that we began to see a lot of that during that decade, where houses began to take on that kind of a feel, and less did we see stick upon stick like we did in the early 50s and 60s.
Many of the buildings at this time and in the recent past were just simply plans with a roof. Good plan, and then you stick a roof on it, either flat or pitched. One of the things which caught my eye here was that this very disciplined approach to doing a plan based on angles is not just a plan with angles, but that concept is carried into the sections and the elevations of the building as well. So you have this angular attitude toward architecture become a spatial idea, which I think is a very wonderful idea.
Reflective of a Northwest tradition and culture with the protective roof overhangs, sloping shed roofs. We called it a gentle mitigation of different forms of the traditional Northwest sloping roofs with the cut-off overhangs sitting on thin columns. And again, we're seeing houses now built on hillsides. Heavily influenced by Guathby Siegel, cubistic, an example of what we determined to be pure art. It was a very powerful form. Now we begin to see some changes in thinking and how architecture relates to its site or to its context, and is a response to the circumstances.
We see a response to the site. It's built into the site. We see a response to an energy-conscious design of trying to capture the insulation value of the earth. A response to the views and to the trees. The house really becomes a part of the site and is very well integrated into the site. And again, it still has a strong geometric power about it that, again, we all felt very good about. This represented kind of a different attitude towards architecture, one that was not typical of the Northwest. I think it was reflective of an attitude that was pervasive among a lot of architects, both locally and in the United States. We termed it as a high-quality piece of work, a serious intellectual endeavor into design.
I think we were all impressed by the fact that we're beginning to see real diversity in approach. There isn't a common theme which you can identify. You have examples of kind of an international intellectual influence. The buildings could perhaps appear anywhere in the world. They weren't the international style of the 20s and 30s, but they were all courant with events all over the world. I think, secondly, we saw examples of people simply doing high art, where the living functions and needs are suppressed and subjugated to the idea of making a pure form which could almost stand as a museum piece. I think we saw examples of the Northwest woodsy type of building, which is always popular in this part of the world, and we saw fine examples of that being very well done indeed, where buildings became part of the site and blended with their setting in a wonderful way. I think we also saw the beginnings of concern about energy, where buildings like the Miller Hall example we saw, nestled into the earth, is starting to be responsible about using a minimal amount of energy. So in short, we saw considerable diversity developing during the decade which we were assigned to consider.
Voodoo economics and Trivial Pursuit worked its deceptive simplification on our consciousness in the 1980s. The on-off world of the personal computer created the opportunity to do more and more work in, well, actually more and more time. Meanwhile, the advent of personal communication created pressure for instant access, instant response, and accelerated the pace of life. Seattle boomed big time and was dubbed like the trendy city, most livable, and latte land by the culture wonks, those in the know. And the 1980s saw the first documented use of the terms soundbite and buzzwords.
The regional cultural tradition.
The Northwest woodsy.
It definitely was a trend.
Earthbound.
Traditional forms, but expressed in a more of a contemporary way.
An affordable house, simple roof shape, multifamily, inner city.
The ubiquitous Northwest style.
Yeah.
Trend towards energy conservation.
Consciousness of community.
The shed roof.
Other influence, the trend.
Yeah, the Northwest style.
The Northwest style.
Northwest.
Oh, Northwest.
Northwest.
Northwest style.
Northwest style.
One of the quotes was, "There's no party line in this decade. There was no sense of agreement as to what constituted a valid approach to residential architecture." So we basically came up with categories, and we found houses that fit those categories. And first category is a Northwest style.
It was a very tight budget, and they decided to investigate the idea of the great room and to design a house around one big open space. And so really the house evolved around this big open space with opportunities for expansion. It provided the inspiration for a very simple form. They like pitched roofs and more of the typical house kind of idea. One of their children had drawn a picture of the house that looked just like this, with the fireplace or the chimney that came up at an angle and the smoke. And that actually was one of the design departures we used and kept reproducing this image.
This is the house that Jim Cutler designed and was published in April of 1988. Was chosen again as a representation of the Northwest regional style, continuing exploration of the bottomless pit of regionalism was the way it was put as
A lot of obituaries have been written about modernism, but it seems somehow to live on. And my feeling, I think shared by a lot of people in this room, is that Wendell has been over the years one of its really brilliant interpreters. We picked the wall house because it is somewhat less extreme and in some ways I think concentrates on the fineness of detail that has marked his career throughout. It also represents a category that Steve may be wanting to mention a little later on. Remodelings began to crop up in our period as something publishable, and the wall house, even though it's a very extreme remodeling, is a remodeling.
Another example of a modernist house that was chosen for this category is Matthews and Henry, again using kind of a modernist vocabulary, very large house. Also shows elements of the Northwest style and its use of materials. Kind of a counterpoint to the earlier modernist examples is a local example of how the postmodernist aesthetic was worked out in this area, and I think the group saw this as not necessarily characteristic of the decade, but certainly a significant subtext to what was going on here. This house sums that up in the most, how to say it, I guess, most aggressive fashion, straightforward fashion, whereas some of the other examples have elements of postmodern design, but they don't, it's more of a timid approach, I guess. This is probably the body of work that's most characteristic of the decade. Most of the houses fell into this category. The group selected this house by Brian Brand and Johann Luxinger to illustrate it.
It was a pretty basic tenet of modernism that you ought to be embarrassed about any references to traditional styles, and the thing that really appeared in this decade was that sense of embarrassment seemed to have vanished. This is a wonderful example of an unembarrassed look at traditional notions, traditional.
The last category, and it's really not a stylistic category, but it's a reflection of really the emphasis on alternative housing types that have been built in the past decade. This project covers a couple of categories, really. It represents a different type of housing, which has been built more frequently in the past decade and has been selected by the committee for showing. It also shows the adaptation of some traditional form characteristics, the cornices on the building and the way the building is massed and kind of in response maybe to Bay Area prototypes.
We did talk about energy conservation a little bit and sort of noting that, in fact, there wasn't a lot of specific projects dealing with new forms of energy conservation, and perhaps deducing from that maybe some of the efforts had now become commonplace and with current codes kind of locked into what we do on an ordinary basis.
A change in terms of breaking away perhaps from the single-family house related to the emphasis of the Home of the Month program, and it was also brought up that in this decade residential remodels became a part of the program, and that in both cases this building type emergence in the program was unique to the decade.
It seems to me that the first movement in modern architecture was motivated by social concerns of getting better housing for more people, and to do it with some kind of economy, and to be related to the machine and to the life of these times. What civilization in the past would have ever stuck up all these different buildings and think that makes some kind of a complex? I mean, and it gets to the point where when people are building an office building in the center of the city, they have a hell of a time figuring out what to do with it, because each one is a unique object all by itself. Ignore everything else, and then you've got a real challenge, because it has to be a pure work of art and something that's depends entirely on its design, not how well it works with everything else. We have to make some kind of more elevated or more inspired approach to houses, I think. And one of the promising things, I think, is Coho as a possibility, where some kind of spaces are created with the buildings, and those things lead to some way of living and relating to each other. And I think that's one of the challenges we ought to think about for the next 50 years,